Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar on teaching practical ethics for psychologists. My name is Andrea Bergoa. I am the Higher Ed Course Adoption Marketing Manager here at APA Publishing. We're happy to have you with us today. I'm going to start our proceedings off today with a few housekeeping notes. While I'm doing this, feel free to introduce yourselves in chat, tell us where you're coming from, what you do. We would love to hear from you. I do want to start by saying that everyone is muted to prevent accidental noises and distractions, but we have multiple modes of communication and interaction for today's session. Of course, we have the chat, which is open and available to all attendees, but if you do have questions for our panelists, we do encourage you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That way it doesn't get lost in the chat. Also, auto captioning has been enabled, and you can access that via the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. As soon as it's available, we will be sharing a recording of this webinar via email that includes captions and a chat transcript. So if you miss something in chat, please don't worry about it. It will be sent to you afterwards. The recording will also be posted to the APA YouTube channel, and we will be sharing resources as we can. As recognition for your attendance today, you will be receiving an attendance certificate and badge that you can share on social media. Please be patient with us on those. Those are a manual process, so it does take a few weeks for those to arrive. We're working on automating that, so stay tuned if you're a regular attendee of these. We thank you again for joining us today. I'm going to start by welcoming our authors to this session on teaching practical ethics for psychologists. We have Samuel Knapp, a retired psychologist and who is Director of Professional Affairs for the Pennsylvania Psychological Association.
Not anymore. I'm retired.
Yes,
But
was.
yeah, okay.
Yes. He's written or edited 16 books and more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and made almost 500 professional presentations on ethics and professional issues. And then we also have Randy Fingerhut, professor of psychology at LaSalle University. He teaches ethics and psychotherapy courses and supervises graduate students within their doctoral program. He is a fellow of the Pennsylvania Psychological Association, serving on their ethics and legislative and governmental affairs committees. So again, thank you everyone for being here, and I am going to turn it over to our esteemed authors to start presenting.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. We are both very excited to be here today and to be sharing this webinar with you. I wanted to start by just sharing just a personal thing, and that is when I first started teaching ethics, I was fortunate to meet Sam at Pennsylvania Psychological Association's Ethical Educators Conference, which Sam started some years ago. And each year, people who have an interest in teaching and learning about ethics meet and present workshops, share ideas about teaching. So a lot of the information that we've had developed and kind of put into the textbook has been a function of just interacting with people who love to learn and teach about ethics. So we're very excited to share this information with you today. So we broke down this webinar into three parts. In the first part, our goal is to share what we see as some essential concepts that inform our construction of the textbook. In the second part, we will talk about some specific teaching strategies that we use in the classroom or at workshops to integrate the material and to engage students in their learning of ethics. And then we hope to devote the last 10 minutes of our talk to questions and answers. Speaking of which, I see many of you are introducing yourself in the chat, and that's great. We love that. If you do have any questions that come up, please use the Q&A function, and we'll draw from that in the last 10 minutes of the talk today.
So learning objectives here parallel the previous slide. We're going to talk about some key principles from the textbook. We'll talk about some pedagogical approaches, and um, and then hopefully in the discussion we'll talk about some challenges or issues that arise when teaching ethics. So, essential concepts in teaching ethics. Well, we take a positive approach. And in 1996, Richard Small and I gave a workshop called Ethics is More Than a Code. And then we used the term positive ethics there. And a few years later, Martin Seligman came out with this article on the American Psychologists on positive psychology. And the two concepts kind of meshed. But Richard and I were very struck by how many people thought that ethics was just following the rules, just following the laws, just something, get this like informed consent. Well, just get this informed consent stuff out of the way. Not now we can do really therapy. Not now we're really getting there. And we thought, well, ethics is more than that. Ethics is also aspirations to doing the very best we can to live out a set of values. So that was a dimension in ethics that we wanted to emphasize. And when I taught ethics to graduate school, I would start by telling my students, like, what do you want to be said at your retirement party? You want it to be like, oh, Sam Knapp, he had a wonderful career. None of the ethical violations brought against him before the State Board of Psychology ever reached the evidentiary proof needed to revoke his license. Well, wow, what a great career. That's looking at ethics from just the floor approach. Ethics is only disciplinary actions. Or do you want to be, he helped a lot of people in his career. So let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, I just want to add one quick
Yeah,
thing, and that is, I think our experience often in giving workshops and teaching is that there often is a fear that is associated with learning ethics. And we know from, all that we've learned in psychology that fear-based learning is not really all that effective. So an essential part of teaching the class is being able to diffuse that fear and being able to create a culture where people can be open about things that they don't know, mistakes that they've made. And to me, that is something that is a big takeaway from the book, is really being able to approach ethics from a positive standpoint, non-fear-based standpoint.
that's a very good point. And, and I would have students do some writing assignments about, ethical reflections. And one of them wrote that she had a nightmare before the ethics class, that the ethics professor pointed his big fat finger at her and said, "You are unethical," yelling at her, "You're unethical." And another student wrote, "I don't like ethical people. They always seem so mean." And I asked him, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, where he worked, the ethics person was a compliance officer who just went in there and make sure you do all the things that are legally mandated, and that was the ethics officer. So um, now some people say, no, aren't you just making a straw man? Are there people that really that only look at ethics in that way? And I got two responses to that. One of which is I think ethics education is changing. So we're gradually moving away from fear-based approaches, but it's still there. And a few years ago, I worked for a national company doing ethics workshops across the United States, and so many of the attendees came in just expecting to be frightened and scared and or having to. Most of them were there because their licensing board required some kind of ethics requirement. It's just something to get out of the way. And they were surprised when I talked about personal values and what's important to you and what are your goals. And the second thing is that all of us can slip into a floor approach under stressful situations. Uh, when we're afraid, yeah, it's very easy to do. Um, so, okay, the next principle, ethical decision making. So, um, you know, generally I work for the five-step method of ethical decision making, we've reviewed a whole lot of ethical models, and five-step models were very common in engineering, airline safety, and so on. They were simplest. It was simple. That was important to us. And you find other good ethical making models. This recent survey had like maybe 30 of them had been proposed, though they're all highly similar. But we want to point out that decision making is not a purely intellectual exercise. Yeah, you need to use your reason, but reason is fallible. We are subject to the fundamental attribution error or confirmation bias and other biases that can twist how we interpret things. Fatigue and anxiety can influence our decisions. Many of you are aware where the study of parole judges. It was found that at the end of the day, they're more likely to not deny parole than to grant it. And so if you're up for parole, make sure that you're at the beginning of the day or right after lunch. Um, but after it's so much easier to deny parole. That's the default position. But fatigue influences our decisions. And last, ethical decision making has a social component to it. And that is we're in a relationship with patients or their families or other people. And what do they think of the decision? How can we involve them in it as much as possible? Um,
Yeah,
let's go to the next one.
I want to just
Yeah.
quickly say one of the things that I do in my first class is I have students replicate the Bernard and Jara study. And in that study, they do one study with students and one student study with clinical psychologists, and they give them two scenarios. One involves a colleague who is engaged in problem drinking, and one who's engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior with a client. And the first question it asks is, strictly speaking, from an ethics code standpoint, what do you think that this what do you think you should do if you were the psychologist who is witnessing this behavior? And then the second question is, if this was one of your fellow students or a colleague, what would you do? And understanding that gap between what the ethics code tells you and what you would feel compelled to do is what we think is really important to understand. And part of this is understanding our own humanness and fallibility and being aware of, as Sam says, some of these biases in our thinking, some of the human factors that play a role in our decision making is important in managing those factors.
So principle three. So development of an ethical identity is a complex process. So we rely heavily on Mitchell Handelsman's ethics acculturation model to illustrate how to integrate personal and professional values. So there's values in the profession exemplified by the ethics code, but other documents as well, and standards that people are expected to adhere to. And um, there's pitfalls in that some people, and I'm sure if you're teaching ethics, you run into it. Some people think that ethics is just got to follow the rules. That's it, period. And others are like, I'm a good person. I have good intuition. I don't need people to tell me how to be a good person. I'm going to help my neighbors. I'm compassionate. What is there to learn other than that? And so we talk about those two extreme perspectives, and then to talk about how it's best to try and integrate them too. That is to maximize your personal values within the context established by the parameters established by the ethics code and other laws and documents with APA. And like I'll use an example of the informed consent process. Like I mentioned before, some people like in my workshops would say, well, just get this ethics, get this over with. Now we can do therapy now. And so, okay, they're following the legal requirement, but what can you do within that legal requirement? You have the opportunity to build a relationship with patients. You have opportunity to improve their expectations by being helpful. You have an opportunity to show that you care about them by welcoming questions and by spending time to answer them very carefully. So within that legal parameter, you have a wide range of options to maximize your personal values. Do you want to say more about that, Randy?
No, I think that's fine. I
Okay.
was going to talk a little bit about self-care.
Yeah.
I've tried to make sure that self-care is an important part of understanding our ethical duties. And I have a class that's entirely devoted to self-care, and I used to have the class later in the semester. And the feedback that I got from students is, well, why didn't we have it earlier? This way we can really be thinking about it throughout the semester. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So I've moved that class to our second class now. And one of the things that we talk about in the class is how self-care is embedded in the ethics code in terms of competency and avoiding harm. And being able to understand how we can manage our self-care and really making it an open-ended and collaborative process. So I have students really think about what self-care means to them. They can set self-care goals at the beginning of the semester, and we devote time in classes to check in on self-care. How are students doing? Acknowledging some of the more stressful times of the semester, and also being open to really thinking about making adjustments based on what's going on. So one thing that I try to talk about with students is when I'm giving my papers and the final exams, how is it overlapping or not overlapping with other classes, and making adjustments so that we're not overloading the students too. And that's part of really modeling a collaborative approach to self-care, where we can think about it not just in terms of individually what people need to do to take care of themselves, but how we can take care of each other. And really understanding how that goes hand in hand with um, good clinical work and good ethical clinical work.
I want to add something there too, Randy. And,
Absolutely.
students are under so much pressure, and I've heard some ethics instructors say that, you know, their self-care discussions fall on deaf ears because students are just too overwhelmed. It's kind of like, oh no, one more thing I got to deal is self-care on top of everything else. Well, if it's adding extra burden, it's not good self-care. But I think I too have thought about how to encourage self-care within the classroom, and I try to make goals and expectations extremely clear, so no student would ever have to ask, is this going to be on the test? Because I would tell them ahead of time, give them a handout. This is all the stuff you need. If it's not on this paper here, you don't need to know it. Try to make the content interesting and relevant. And used a lot of collaborative learning, in part because it's effective to help people learn, but also I want to build cohesion within the group. I want people to like each other. And I tell them, that student that your colleague, student, fellow student you talk to, you maybe think they're kind of weird or they have an annoying habit or something like that. They might be your best friend. They may be the person who really helps you out when you need it. And so you value the relationships that you have. And then, of course, treat everyone with respect. And then, of course, the didactic portion on self-care, too, I think is important. Self-care is so important that I think the evidence is pretty clear now that self psychotherapists who have good well-being get better patient outcomes. In fact, I think the evidence is so strong now that uh, so colleagues and I wrote an article. Many of you are familiar with Louis Castonguay's principles of change, um, trans-theoretical principles have evidence supported that these are principles that that improve patient outcomes. And we wrote an article that when that gets updated, maybe therapists' well-being should be one of these trans-theoretical principles of change, because I think the evidence is so strong there now.
Mm.
Um,
So, one of the things that we try to embed in our classes is really thinking about the ethical principles. And even though the APA Ethics Code states that the principles are aspirational, in fact, following the principles can be a very important part of decision making. And Sam wrote an article several years ago where he goes through each of the standards of the APA Ethics Code and talks about how they're informed by the ethical principles. So I think to me that's very illustrative. Sometimes it can be very overwhelming to really think about all the standards and the rules. But being able to be familiar with how principles inform our understanding of ethics is really important. In particular, we cover Beecham and Childress's principle-based decision making, which is really trying to understand ethical dilemmas in terms of competing principles. So when we go over ethical dilemmas with students, one thing that can be helpful is to ask students how they see the dilemma in terms of competing principles, which principle seems to be most salient, how can you make decisions that best honor the ethical principles. So really reinforcing this idea of using the principles of the ethics code as a guide to facilitate decision making. As Sam had said before, in the textbook, we use a five-step ethical decision-making model. And I personally think it's important for students to get lots of practice in using the model. So if we think about it from a learning perspective, there's a didactic component of learning where you kind of demonstrate the skill or the information. Then there's what I call like the low stakes practice. So in each class, I try to devote time to having students practice applying the concept to a particular real world type of ethical dilemma. I like to have them work in small groups. And by doing that, it encourages collaboration and practice. So that way, at the end of the class, they've had several opportunities to practice using ethical decision-making models to address ethical dilemmas. Um, One of the things that I have discovered in my teaching is Johnson and colleagues' communitarian ethics. And when I first read their articles, it really struck me how often we take an individualized approach to ethics and really understanding how we can develop support networks in order to make better ethical decisions. And also to manage some of the stress that often accompanies ethical dilemmas. So we try to make sure that we are infusing that in our classes, both in terms of introducing communitarian ethics and their competence constellation model, but also making sure that students have the opportunity to practice consulting with each other, working in small groups, sharing their experiences, and even thinking about what their professional support network is going to look like once they graduate. And again, to me, this is also consistent with quality enhancement strategies. So really thinking about consultation as an important part of ethical decision making. So we can illustrate the concept, but also model it within the classroom in order to reinforce its importance.
I think this is very important. I think that uh, Brad Johnson, Jeff Barnett, Nancy Ellman, Florence Caslow, and Linda Forrest article is one of the most important ethics articles in our century so far. The only problem is I wish I had written it, but they that didn't happen. Um, so it's all very important. I think Randy, thinking about our presentation today, I think one thing we failed to do, which we should have, is had to have a gratitude page.
Hmm.
And a lot of the workshops we do, we have a gratitude page, and it's like you had like 30, 40 names of people, and it ends with and others because all these people contribute in some way. And even though we've made the final decision as to what to include in the slides and all that stuff, all these people have had a say and influence how we think about things. Um, so um,
Yeah, I think and to me, especially in um, this day and age where there's increasing isolation, really being able to value the connections that we have with our professional colleagues. So those are our principles. We wanted to share some strategies that we use in the classroom that we found to be helpful in teaching ethics.
so the ethics and autobiography, there's journal writing for self-reflection. There's a whole lot of different ways to do this. Here's one example of a journal prompt here. What is your idea of right and wrong personal behavior? Where does this conception come from? Um, in the instructor's guide that you can get the resources, you have a copy of this syllabi, and you see how I phrase things slightly different in my ethics autobiography. Uh, the book makes reference to an article by Mitchell Handelsman about writing ethics autobiographies. So anything that gets them to reflect, write down. And so what I would do is, I get this assignment, read people's things, and then I'd have like a whole lecture, maybe half an hour or so, saying these are the key themes that emerged, and talk about them. And if there's ever someone wrote something that was particularly important, I would go ask them personally ahead of time, is it okay if we talk about this in the class? Because I think this is particularly helpful. Uh, so I think this is a very important part of a teaching strategy.
I think it's also a way to connect with the ethics acculturation model by being able to reflect on how do we come up with our own personal ethical identity and how does it mesh and how does it not overlap with professional obligations. So that self-awareness can be really helpful. One of the things that's really challenging is finding ways to keep students engaged. One of my colleagues gave a workshop on teaching and developed this two-axis where you think about like on one axis is level of engagement and the other axis is number of students. So you want to create opportunities where the most students as possible have the most levels of engagement. So when you are just simply doing something, lecturing, there may be a handful of students that are engaged, right? But when you're creating opportunities for each student to think about something in a deep way, that's kind of the sweet spot. So one of the ways that I like to do that is by giving polls. And there's a number of online polls that you can use. I use Poll Everywhere. But the idea is to give people the opportunity to think about things. So I have some polls related to multiple relationships. So I give them a bunch of scenarios and ask them, is this never ethical, ethical under rare conditions, ethical under some conditions, most conditions, or always ethical? And the poll results come in. So then you can follow up on that. So here's an example, attending your client's wedding, right? So if you put never ethical, like asking someone who would want to share why it's never ethical. Someone who says under rare conditions, well, what would those conditions be, right? So I think often when you involve more members of the class, you get ideas that maybe some people wouldn't have thought about. Okay, well, what if you're working within a small religious community where it's expected that everyone attends the wedding? So you come up with those exceptions to the rule. So polls, I think, can be a nice way to engage students in the material and really to have them think or even rethink their perspectives as it relates to ethical topics. Another tool that I like to use in class is something called Perusal. Perusal is a social annotation tool, and I first learned about it from a colleague of mine. And the reason why I started adopting it is that I found that students were not reading the articles that I assigned for class, and that was very frustrating to me. But what Perusal does is you can set up assignments, you can download articles into Perusal, and then students can annotate the articles and write comments. So here's just an example of a comment that you can see here. And students can comment on other people's comments. You can upvote comments, which is kind of like a like function. So for many students who are, obviously very familiar with social media, it's a very easy way to get engaged in the materials. And there's some really interesting discussions that often come up in the annotated comments, which you can then integrate into the class to say, okay, well, we had a really interesting discussion about this article. Let's talk about it more. So I think it helps students get more engaged in the articles, communicate with each other, and then you can also see what they're taking away from the articles and reinforce in class.
So this is the strength and weaknesses exercise. I have no idea where it came from, but I would have students, okay, write on a piece of paper, you don't have to share this with anybody. You can if you want to, but what are your three greatest strengths as a psychotherapist? And then a couple minutes, and I asked students if who wanted to share, and students were always very willing to share. It's never a problem. And then I say, okay, now take those three strengths that you wrote, describe how in some circumstances they could be a weakness. And then the students would write, take a couple minutes and then to share what they wrote down. It was just one way to get them to think about themselves and uh, gain greater awareness of themselves. Um, do you
I
ever
love
use
it
this?
because yeah, it really gets people to think critically, right? To think about, okay, how can something in one circumstance be a strength and in another context be a limitation?
Now, this is an exercise from Gary Schulner, and he labeled it How to Seduce a Patient exercise. So this is what you do. You have the class into two groups. In the first group, you write down at least 7 attributes that they would want for an ideal psychotherapist. The second group, write down at least 7 attributes that they would want in the ideal romantic partner. And then so they spend their time writing these lists here, and you just kind of watch them, and most people stop writing, you end it. And then you just have the group share, what did you come up with? And I write them on the board. I want someone who's good at listening, someone who has a sense of humor, someone who's conscientious and responsible. And then those are the things that came, and they come up in both lists. And it's like, why is it that you have to be careful about boundaries? Why is it you have to be careful about how patients might respond to you? Because these are attributes which can be very attractive. So this is just one way to get them to think about their relationships with other people.
So I have my own rough formula for how I want to break down an ethics class. And, again, it's not strict, but usually I think about one third lecture, one third large group discussion, and one third experiential learning opportunities. And I think to me, it's a way to break up the class. It's a way to make the concepts really tied in with practical experiences, and also really helping students develop skills through deliberate practice. So I really like the idea of having students work in small groups, depending on your class size. It could be anywhere from like 3 to 4 students, and assigning dilemmas for work. And usually I try to pick dilemmas that relate to the topic. So if we're covering multiple relationships, we'll find some multiple relationship dilemmas. Confidentiality, we'll find some dilemmas around that. And I'll usually have the group assign one person to be a note taker, to take notes. So we have them work in small groups. Often I'll ask them to practice using the ethical decision-making model. Sometimes I'll have them, make sure that they have copies of the ethics codes available for reference point. Um, and I think the nice thing about it is that they get to collaborate with each other and they get to talk to each other, which I think the students enjoy. And then after the small group work, then we'll usually reconvene as a large class, and then I'll get people to present what they came up with. And sometimes I might assign each group a different dilemma just so that they can share the different dilemmas. But other times, having different groups work on the same dilemma is really interesting as well, because you see people come up with different ideas, different solutions for that. So I think about it in terms of the teaching process. Being able to have that deliberate practice helps prepare and students help students to develop the skills, which I can then assess at the end of class. So at the end of class, I give them a paper where they each have to individually apply an ethical decision-making model to a new dilemma. So having them do the small group work prepares them for the end of the semester task. Also, I think it can be really helpful to have students do in-class exercises, and I like to use the think, pair, share model. So I give them a task for them to think about and take notes. So here's an example. In my self-care class, I have each student do their own self-care assessment and identify self-care practices that they want to work on. So I'll have students work on this individually. Then I'll have them pair up and share what they're coming up with in terms of ideas. And then we can talk as a large group about this. So the self-care action plan, it's not a graded task. It's just really a task to promote self-reflection. And it's something that can be a reference point. So I'll usually assign at least one journal entry where they can do their own self-care assessment midway through the semester. Okay, how's that going for you? What are some unexpected challenges? What have you been able to implement? And I think the important thing for these journal assignments is knowing that they can share and be heard and understood in a non-judgmental way. So I make sure that I can let them know that I'm hearing what they're saying. Sometimes if a student is struggling and they want to meet one-on-one, I can offer that to them if they'd like. But again, I think the idea here is really promoting that critical thinking, self-reflection, which we see as really important to both developing one's identity as an ethical psychologist and as a really important ethical decision-making skill. And then we try to encourage students to continue their education outside of the classroom. So one thing I like to do in my classes is I offer students extra credit for attending workshops or webinars that relate to some ethical issue. And I think this accomplishes a few things. One is it reinforces this idea of humility, meaning that our learning is not static. We're always, trying to fill in the gaps of what we don't know. I think it's also a nice way to give students the opportunity to compensate if they had a bad exam or didn't do well on a particular assignment. And there are lots, I offer them also like opportunities that don't cost any money. So one website that we really like is John Gavazzi's Ethics and Psychology website. I have the link here, but I think it might also be in the chat as well. And John's a colleague of ours, and he has this great website that has new articles that relate to ethics, podcasts that he's done over the years. He has an ethical dilemmas page where people can comment on. So again, this idea of like really seeing learning as dynamic, not static, and really encouraging the attitude of continuous learning and improvement.
So I'm like Randy in that I didn't lecture a whole lot. I don't think if I have a lecture over 30 minutes, then that's pretty rare. I get group interaction a lot. And sometimes I would assign podcasts from John Gavazzi's website. So they don't have to listen to me lecture. They can just listen to one of these podcasts and get the information at their leisure, at their own time. Um, and humility is really important. I mean, we're always learning stuff. And I was fortunate in that um, students I had at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine and also Lehigh University, a lot of them were older. Not too many came directly through undergraduate to graduate, and they worked in all kinds of different environments that I'd never worked in before, and all kinds of cultural backgrounds, and so I was always learning from them, and they'd raise issues, and I think, I never thought about that before. Let's kind of think it through together, or they'd have perspectives on things that um, it never occurred to me. So um, the last workshop I did, I put one of my learning objectives. I want to learn from. Well, I gave the learning objectives for the workshop participants. Then I also had a slide where I gave the learning objectives for me. And one of the learning objectives is I want to learn from you about what's helpful in this area, what's not helpful, and so on. Now, humility does not mean humiliation. The definition of humility is trying to get an accurate view of ourselves. And we do that best when we have interactions with other people who can hopefully, in a gentle way, tell us when we're wrong, or missing something, or can improve something. So we're big on humility.
Um, I think I'm seeing some questions coming up in the Q&A, so maybe we could shift to that. And we just to guide the discussion, we have just two questions for you all to consider too. One is, what are some challenges that you faced when teaching ethics? And what strategies have you found to be effective? So this is certainly not an exhaustive list that we've come up with. So if there are some things that you are finding to be helpful, we'd love to know about it, and maybe others would too.
Absolutely. I love those questions, and please feel free if you feel comfortable answering them in the chat, please do. It's not mandatory, of course. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was certainly eye-opening for me. There are quite a few questions in the chat. I think one of the big ones that also speaks to some of the questions that we've gotten in advance is from Benjamin. Benjamin says AI has been a big recent change in teaching ethics. For example, when having class work through an ethical decision-making framework, they will often ask ChatGPT what current laws are for the state, what regulation applies, and how the ethical code should be considered. Do you have any ideas about integrating AI into teaching ethics?
Yes. So I think speaking of humility, as an educator, I feel like there's a lot of catching up that I need to do. So I've been trying to find every opportunity that I can to talk with other educators on AI and how it's emerging in the classroom, how to use it most effectively, and some concerns about academic integrity. So, one thing that I've learned is the importance of being clear with your AI policy. And there are generally like three types of policies. One is absolutely you cannot use AI under no circumstances at all. So, again, if that's your policy, you should be clear about that. Um, the other extreme is saying, okay, well, AI is there, it's out there for anyone to use. Use it however you wish. In fact, we encourage you to use AI because it's important to develop that as its own new emerging skill set. For me, I fall somewhere in between. So I think it's important to really not. So in other words, if you say, okay, well, I don't believe in AI, I don't want to think about AI. Well, AI is here. So even if you're not thinking about it, your students are thinking about it. So I think it's important to approach AI in a collaborative sense with your students. So part of that is thinking about how AI can be potentially useful, thinking about some of the concerns in terms of the ethical principles. So in what ways is it beneficial? In what ways is it potentially harmful? How can we use AI in a way that is respectful? Um, and how can we use AI in a way that facilitates your own learning and doesn't get in the way? So in my class, I've developed, I was going to see if I could share that, but see if I can pull that up. I've developed an academic integrity statement, which was also facilitated with the use of AI, but I also share this with students to get their feedback. So it's a draft, it's a work in progress. But it tries to identify some things in which you can really be just some guidelines for using AI. So I say to students that if they do use AI, they should submit a separate document with the tools that they used, the specific prompts and output. And I think that's important to know, one, how people are using AI and making sure that it's being used properly. Also, like APA has its own guidelines for citing use of AI. You can't use AI unless you have the appropriate permissions and consent to use it. You have to use AI in a critical way, so you can't uncritically accept whatever AI tells you. Whatever you put, you have responsibility for. So you simply can't say, well, AI, ChatGPT told me that this was right, right? You have to do the work in verifying the information that you're getting. That we have to be respectful of human autonomy and not use AI in any ways that would deceive, coerce, or harm anyone. Making sure that you're not using any information that would identify clients, and that you shouldn't just simply ask AI a question, copy and paste it into a document. But again, I try to make sure that we have open conversations about AI, that we talk about it, and also really think about how it might be used in creative ways in the classroom too. So one assignment could be, okay, well, ask ChatGPT a question about an ethical dilemma, find out what information it gives you. Now critically evaluate that information. what's accurate, what's not accurate. So to me, I think it's really important to be aware of the AI tools that are out there, and also being able to use this as teaching opportunities for ethics.
I think that's really great, Randy. And the idea of using it to reinforce students' critical thinking skills. And we go back to the uh, our discussion of ethical decision making, and some of the factors we had there is that it's a social process that involves patients and significant others, and so AI can never tell you what the patient's preferences are. And AI is only as good as the information you give it. So if you have confirmation bias that distorts what you're giving AI, you're going to get a screwy answer.
I think the other thing too is that it's presenting all kinds of ethical dilemmas too. So we've seen people using AI inappropriately for therapeutic purposes. We've seen some of the really tragic downsides of people using AI who are suicidal. So I think these are opportunities for discussion too. And I really like to pull from what's going on currently that relates to ethics into the classroom. And, AI is presenting a lot of interesting questions to consider.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I linked some AI resources in the chat while y'all were discussing. Um, okay, so we have so many great questions. Um, there is one question that we got at the beginning that I do love. My question is, this is from Israt. If you had to prioritize one ethical competency that every psychology student must master before graduation, what would it be and why?
You want to go, Randy, or you want me to go? Or
One, only one?
I know it's so hard to just choose one.
I would pick two, and the two that
Go
I
for
would
it.
pick would be self-reflection, and the second is the ability to build social relationships.
That's great. I might throw in there also humility because, I think one thing that I often talk about in class is the Dunning-Kruger effect, that often people who are least competent are least aware of their own lack of competence. So by really critically evaluating ourselves in a non-judgmental way, we can really approach that positive ethics standard. So to me, I think, not being overconfident and recognizing that we always have more to learn.
Yes, that's very important. And if we inflate our competence a little bit, we're really at the 50th percentile, but we say we're in the 60th. Okay, probably doesn't make much of a difference. But there's some data with physicians that said some physicians rate themselves really high, and they're really, on objective measures, quite low. And I've had some experience with some mental health professionals that I saw that who had just got horrible outcomes, but you know, well, I'm the only one who tells it like it is. Patients drop out after 3 sessions. Well, because I tell them the truth. I'm the only one who's brave enough to tell them the truth. That's why they're leaving. It's because I'm actually morally superior to everybody else. And so, yeah, humility and humility allows us the opportunity to grow and improve.
Absolutely.
I was wondering if I could address the question on gifts.
Yes,
Because
please
I just
do.
find it
Please do.
so, I find it so interesting. Like I love talking about it because I try to encourage students to come up with their own rules and then come up with why those rules are not helpful. So, for example, some students will tell me, well, I was told by my supervisor that I can accept gifts as long as they're under $20. So I ask people to come up with gifts that would be under $20 that you would never want to accept. Would you accept a $15 bag of marijuana? Would you accept a $5 piece of undergarment? you know. So no, so I think to me, like it's the idea of really understanding that each instance requires its own examination of context. And certainly, I think with gift giving, understanding the client's culture is really an important part of the decision-making process.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
I love talking about it because we realize that rule-governed behavior often is not helpful, and thoughtful analysis of what are all the factors and how does it relate to the ethical principles can really help us make decisions that are best suited to our clients.
Mhm.
That's very good, Randy. And I re reminded of an article on ethics and behavior a number of years ago, which, European American therapist trained a woman from Japan, which has a gift-giving culture. And to refuse a gift is a major insult. And the therapist said, "Oh no, this is over $20. I can't accept it." Well, it just blew it's just, they just didn't understand the significance of the gift.
That's great. Okay. Randy, were there any others that you spotted in Q&A that you wanted to make sure you answered?
How must one blind their personal values, views, and beliefs that contradict with some ethical principles? Hmm.
It's an
Can
interesting
can
one.
you even do that?
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I don't know what ethical principle we want to overturn. I mean, Beecham Childress, beneficence, helping people, non-maleficence, avoiding harm, respecting patient decision making, um, ensuring good relationships with patients. I don't know which one you'd want to overturn.
I
Um,
think it's the opposite. I think rather than blinding oneself, it's really about being aware and being able to take a step back and often like question ourselves, what's guiding our decision making? Is this more of our own personal value, or is this something that's consistent with um, being culturally sensitive and also being uh, acting in a way that's consistent with the ethical principles themselves? So I think it's not really, to me, it's about recognizing our blind spots, not blinding ourselves per se. Oh, there was a human rights question.
There was.
So the question is how you suggest integrating human rights content and lenses in the teaching and practice of ethics consistent with APA commitment to human rights. Human rights content is especially important because US students are so focused on avoiding imposing a US only perspective on ethics that they often don't recognize their ethical responsibility to recognize, name, and address behaviors that are violations of human rights, particularly as it concerns the human rights of girls and women, which many communities and individuals subordinate to those of boys and men with the excuse of culture. So I think it's important to, like, when going over and introducing the ethics code, being able to look at the changes that were made specific to human rights. And I think that often can be a really important discussion to understand the context behind those changes. And also being able to understand that, justice is one of the fundamental ethical principles of the code. I don't know if you had anything to add on that.
but yeah, well, um, I'm what's called a soft universalist, which means that I believe there's certain universal values that transcend cultures. Now, cultures might uh, interpret them or implement them in various ways that we need to be respectful of, but there's certain things that just are not negotiable. Gratuitous torture is never, no. Systematic discrimination or degradation of certain people because their demographics, no. You know, so yeah, as Randy says, justice is one of the foundational principles of Beecham and Childress, and we should teach it and try to live by it. And being ethical, usually for psychologists, we think about being ethical as being ethical in interpersonal relationships. How do I treat this patient in front of me, and so on. But if you want to be really ethical, I think you need to look at also systemic issues as well. Some of the social determinants of behavior. And that means uh, speaking out when there's scientific evidence that shows that there's a social harm being done. And I emphasize scientific evidence. We don't want to be just spouting off opinions without any data behind them. But I think that part of being ethical is, for example, um, doing what we can about great income inequality, because nothing makes a person more miserable than being hungry. And I had students who worked with in refugee organizations, and they say, um, "What do I do about therapy when the kid before me hasn't had a meal? How am I supposed to do therapy if they're?" One of the thing about is, uh, when can I find something next to eat next?
Mhm. All right. Well, I think we have reached the end of our time. Are there any like final parting thoughts, Samuel and
Oh,
Randy, that
yeah.
you would like to leave with our audience?
Sorry, I didn't. Yes. Well, I guess we have the website
Hmm.
for the textbook that's available. And then there's also a resources page. Andrea, is that in the chat as well?
Yeah, and I can add it again. Yeah.
And here's our contact information. And we thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
And we're going to ask Andrea to, if she's able to, preserve the chat so we can look over the many comments and learn something from it as well.
Yes,
So thank you very
absolutely.
much.
Yep, we will. And I want to thank everyone who attended today for being here, participating in the conversation, and asking such great questions. If you asked a question and we didn't get to it, I sincerely apologize. Please look for an email from us in the coming days with a link to the recording, complete with captions and a chat transcript, and your attendance certificates will be coming in the next few weeks. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone, and have a great day.